A crisp afternoon breeze swept through downtown Seattle as 73-year-old Margaret Henderson browsed through the local farmers market. She loved her Wednesday routine, picking fresh flowers for her dining table and grabbing organic vegetables for her famous homemade soup. The market was bustling with its usual charm, vendors calling out their deals, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air, and friendly faces everywhere. Margaret paused at her favorite flower stall, admiring a bunch of vibrant yellow daffodils. That's when she felt it, that familiar, terrifying tightness in her chest. Her breathing became labored, each breath more difficult than the last. In her rush to catch the early morning bus, she'd forgotten her inhaler on her bedside table. After 40 years of managing her asthma, this was her worst nightmare coming true. Mrs. Chen, the kind-faced owner of the Asian grocery stall next door, noticed Margaret's distress immediately. The elderly woman was now leaning heavily against the flower stand, her face turning pale as she struggled for air. "Someone call 911." Mrs. Chen shouted, rushing to Margaret's side and helping her to sit on a nearby wooden crate. Within minutes, a police patrol car arrived, its blue and red lights reflecting off the market's glass windows. Officer James Barrett stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached the growing crowd of concerned onlookers. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with the confident stride of someone still trying to prove themselves. "She needs help right away," Mrs. Chen explained, her voice urgent. "The pharmacy across the street has emergency inhalers. My daughter works there. She can get one quickly." Officer Barrett held up his hand, stopping Mrs. Chen before she could move. "Ma'am, we need to wait for proper medical personnel. We can't just give her random medication." His voice was firm, almost dismissive, as if he'd dealt with 100 similar situations and knew better than everyone else. The crowd grew restless. Margaret's lips were starting to take on a bluish tinge, her wheezing audible to everyone nearby. An elderly man in a worn baseball cap spoke up. "Officer, please. She clearly needs help now." But Barrett stood his ground, repeatedly citing protocol and regulations, seeming more concerned with following rules than addressing the emergency at hand. People started pulling out their phones, some recording, others trying to call for additional help. The tension in the air was as thick as the summer humidity. Margaret's eyes darted around in panic, her hands clutching her chest as she fought for every breath. A young woman in scrubs who had stopped at the market after her hospital shift tried to reason with the officer. "As a nurse, I can tell you she's showing signs of severe respiratory distress. We can't wait." But Officer Barrett remained unmoved, his stance becoming more defensive with each passing moment. The sound of another siren pierced the air, and a second police car pulled up to the scene. The crowd parted as heavy footsteps approached, the commanding presence of Police Chief Michael Henderson cutting through the tension like a knife. The chief's eyes scanned the scene, landing first on Officer Barrett's rigid posture, then moving to the struggling woman on the crate. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. "Mom." The chief's voice cracked, a sound that made Officer Barrett's head snap up in attention. The color drained from the young officer's face as realization dawned. The woman he'd been denying help to was his superior's mother. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Chief Henderson rushed to Margaret's side, his authority and composure momentarily replaced by the raw concern of a son seeing his mother in distress. The next few moments moved in a blur of activity. The chief's authoritative voice cut through the chaos, ordering the immediate retrieval of an inhaler. Mrs. Chen's daughter ran from the pharmacy, inhaler in hand, and within minutes, Margaret's breathing began to stabilize. The relief on everyone's faces was palpable, but the incident was far from over. As Margaret took in deep, grateful breaths, Officer Barrett stood frozen, the weight of his poor judgment beginning to sink in. This was just the beginning of a story that would shake the Seattle Police Department to its core and spark a conversation about compassion in law enforcement that would extend far beyond the city limits. The confrontation at the farmers' market quickly turned into something bigger than anyone expected. Officer Barrett stood rooted to the spot, his hands trembling slightly as he watched Chief Henderson comfort his mother. The crowd that had gathered was now muttering quietly, many still recording with their phones. The bright afternoon sun felt uncomfortably hot on Barrett's neck as he realized just how badly he had mishandled the situation. Mrs. Chen, the market vendor who had first called for help, was busy making sure Margaret had a comfortable place to sit while she recovered. She brought over a cup of warm tea and a gentle smile that seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. "Drink this slowly," she said, patting Margaret's hand. "It will help calm your nerves." Chief Henderson was trying his best to maintain his professional composure, but anyone could see the worry lines etched deep in his forehead. He kept one hand on his mother's shoulder while making necessary calls on his phone. The way he looked at Officer Barrett spoke volumes. It wasn't just anger, but deep disappointment. I was just following protocol," Barrett stammered when the chief finally approached him. His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. The excuse that had seemed so solid minutes ago now felt as flimsy as tissue paper in the rain. The young officer's face had turned red with shame, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool breeze. A small crowd was still lingering around, including the nurse who had tried to help earlier. She stepped forward, her hospital scrubs slightly wrinkled from her long shift. "Protocol is important," she said, looking directly at Officer Barrett, "but it should never override common sense and basic human compassion." The chief nodded at her words. "Barrett," he said, his voice stern but controlled, "meet me in my office first thing tomorrow morning." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. Several onlookers had already posted videos of the incident online, and phones around the market were buzzing with notifications as the story began to spread. Margaret, now breathing more easily, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and understanding in her eyes. Despite what had happened, she could see the young officer's regret written all over his face. "Michael," she called to her son, her voice still a bit shaky but growing stronger. "Remember you were young once too. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we learn in public." But the damage was already done. Local news vans were pulling up to the market, their reporters eager for the story. The vendors who had witnessed everything were already being approached for interviews. The incident was quickly becoming more than just a medical emergency. It was turning into a spotlight on police conduct and judgment. Officer Barrett's partner, who had been directing traffic around the emergency vehicles, finally approached him. "Come on," he said quietly. "We need to file our incident report." As they walked back to their patrol car, the whispers and stares from the crowd followed them. Some people were shaking their heads, while others looked on with a mix of anger and pity. The market, which had been a place of cheerful commerce just an hour ago, now buzzed with intense discussions. People shared their own stories of encounters with police, debating about rules versus common sense. Mrs. Chen's daughter arrived from the pharmacy with some backup inhalers, just in case, showing the kind of thoughtfulness that Officer Barrett had failed to display. Chief Henderson helped his mother stand, supporting her as she got ready to head home. The incident had shaken her, but her main concern seemed to be for the young officer who had made such a serious error in judgment. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes," she told her son as they walked slowly to his car, "even if those mistakes are pretty big ones." The story was already spreading across social media platforms, with hashtags forming and comments flooding in. What had started as a simple trip to the farmer's market had become a moment that would force the entire police department to take a hard look at their training and protocols. As the sun began to set over Seattle, nobody involved in the incident could have guessed how this one afternoon would change their lives and their community forever. The next morning, tensions at the Seattle Police Department were running high. The video of Officer Barrett denying help to Margaret Henderson had gone viral overnight, with millions of views and thousands of angry comments. Local news stations had been running the story on repeat since dawn, their cameras camped outside the police station like hungry birds waiting for crumbs of information. Officer Barrett arrived early, his uniform pressed perfectly. a stark contrast to his pale, sleepless face. The walk through the station's hallway felt like the longest of his life. Other officers gave him a wide berth, some avoiding eye contact while others whispered as he passed. The weight of his badge felt unusually heavy that morning. In the break room, the morning news was playing on the small TV mounted in the corner. Police officer denies inhaler to chief's mother, the headline screamed. Barrett quickly poured his coffee and left, unable to watch himself on screen. His hand shook slightly as he walked towards the chief's office, causing hot coffee to splash onto his freshly pressed sleeve. Inside the chief's office, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Henderson sat behind his desk, looking like he'd aged years overnight. Files and papers were spread across his desk, including what appeared to be Barrett's service record. The blinds were partially closed, creating shadows that made the chief's expression even more serious. "Sit down, Barrett," the chief said, his voice carrying the weight of both a commanding officer and a concerned son. "Do you understand why you're here?" The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. Before Barrett could respond, there was a knock at the door. The department's internal affairs representative entered, followed by the police union representative. This wasn't just going to be a simple reprimand. This was serious. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret was sitting in her living room, surrounded by concerned neighbors who had brought over meals and well wishes. Mrs. Chen from the market had even stopped by with some special tea and healing herbs. The local news was trying to get an interview, but Margaret had declined. She was more concerned about the young officer than about becoming a media sensation. Back at the station, Barrett tried to explain his actions. "I was trying to follow protocol, sir. We're trained to wait for medical professionals." His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow his words sounded. The chief leaned forward, his fingers interlaced on the desk. "Protocol." Chief Henderson's voice was controlled but carried an edge sharper than a razor. "Let me tell you about protocol, Officer Barrett. Protocol is meant to guide us, not blind us. Yesterday, you watched an elderly woman struggle to breathe, and you chose paperwork over humanity." The internal affairs representative was taking notes, her pen scratching against paper in the quiet room. Outside, they could hear the usual bustle of the police station, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside the office. "The thing is, Barrett," the chief continued, "this isn't just about my mother anymore. This is about trust. Every person who watched that video is now wondering if we care more about rules than people's lives." Social media was exploding with new hashtags. #LeatherBreath and #ProtocolOverPeople were trending. Local community leaders were calling for a review of police training procedures. What had started as one officer's poor decision was quickly becoming a catalyst for larger discussions about police discretion and human compassion. Barrett sat there, listening to the chief outline the consequences of his actions. He would be suspended pending a full investigation. He would need to undergo additional training. But most importantly, he would need to rebuild trust, not just with the department, but with the entire community. As the meeting concluded, the chief shared one final thought. "You know what's ironic, Barrett? My mother called me this morning. And do you know what she said? She's worried about you. That's the kind of person you denied help to yesterday. Someone who can still find compassion for others, even after what happened." Those words hit Barrett harder than any official reprimand could. As he left the chief's office, he knew his career would never be the same. But more importantly, he realized that his understanding of what it meant to be a police officer needed to change. The hallway ahead of him seemed longer than ever, but each step would need to be the beginning of making things right. The story took an unexpected turn when Margaret Henderson decided to visit the police station herself 3 days after the incident. She walked through the front doors with determination, despite her son's protests over the phone earlier that morning. The reception area fell silent as people recognized her from the viral video, phones discreetly recording her presence. She carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth, the same way she'd brought treats to her son's station when he was a rookie officer 25 years ago. The desk sergeant, who had known Margaret for years, quickly stood up to help her. "Mrs. Henderson, can I assist you with anything?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Yes, dear," Margaret smiled warmly. "I'd like to speak with Officer Barrett, if possible." Her request sent a ripple of whispers through the lobby. The desk sergeant exchanged uncertain glances with his colleagues, but Margaret's gentle determination made it clear she wouldn't take no for an answer. Officer Barrett was in the records room, assigned to filing duty during his modified work schedule, when he got the call. His hands grew clammy as he made his way to the conference room where Margaret waited. The same woman he had denied help to just days ago was now sitting there, arranging homemade cookies on a paper plate. "Mrs. Henderson, Barrett started, his voice catching in his throat as he entered the room. But Margaret raised her hand gently to stop him. "Sit down, young man," she said, pushing the plate of cookies toward him. "We need to talk, and I believe conversations go better with something sweet." The tension in Barrett's shoulders began to ease slightly as Margaret shared stories about her son's early days on the force. "Michael made mistakes too, you know," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Once, he was so nervous during his first traffic stop that he forgot to ask for the driver's license." Her laugh was warm and genuine, making it hard to believe this was the same woman who had been struggling to breathe just days ago. Outside the conference room, curious officers pretended to shuffle papers while trying to peek through the windows. Chief Henderson, arriving back from a meeting, stopped in his tracks when he saw his mother chatting with Barrett. He watched through the glass, his expression a mixture of concern and amazement. "The thing is," Margaret continued, her voice becoming more serious, "what happened at the market wasn't just about an inhaler. It was about seeing the person behind the emergency." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photo album. "These are pictures from when Michael was growing up. Every time he put on his uniform, I reminded him that everyone he meets is somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's loved one." Barrett looked at the old photographs. A young Chief Henderson in his first uniform, proudly standing next to his mother. The images brought home the human aspect of his job in a way no training manual ever had. His eyes grew misty as he realized how close his actions had come to tragedy. The conversation between Margaret and Barrett lasted over an hour. Through the windows, officers watched as the young officer's rigid posture gradually relaxed, as genuine smiles were exchanged, and as healing began to take place. What they witnessed wasn't just a victim forgiving an officer. It was a lesson in humanity that would impact the entire department. As Margaret prepared to leave, she handed Barrett a small paper bag. "My special honey lemon cookies," she explained. "Michael tells me you've been having a rough time with all this. Remember, dear, mistakes don't define us. It's how we learn from them that matters." Chief Henderson, who had been waiting outside, watched as his mother hugged the young officer who had denied her help just days ago. The sight brought a complex mix of emotions: pride in his mother's capacity for forgiveness, hope for Barrett's growth, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. As Margaret left the station that day, she had done more than just make peace with Officer Barrett. She had reminded an entire police department that behind every badge, every protocol, and every decision, there needed to be a heart that could recognize the humanity in others. The story of her visit spread through the department like wildfire, becoming a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons in law enforcement come from the most unexpected teachers. The aftermath of Margaret's visit to the police station spread through the community like ripples in a pond. Local news stations, which had been running critical stories about police protocols, now found themselves covering a different angle, one of forgiveness, learning, and community healing. The morning news even ran a special segment titled, "When Compassion Meets Protocol," a story of second chances. Officer Barrett's perspective on policing had shifted dramatically. During his mandatory retraining sessions, he shared his experience with other officers, his voice carrying a new weight of understanding. "I kept thinking about the rulebook," he explained to his colleagues, "when I should have been thinking about the person right in front of me." At the farmer's market, where the incident had occurred, Things were slowly returning to normal. Mrs. Chen had set up a small first aid station near her stall, complete with basic medical supplies and emergency contact numbers. Other vendors followed her lead, creating a network of safety spots throughout the market. What had started as a crisis was transforming into a community coming together. One particularly warm afternoon, Chief Henderson visited the market during his lunch break. As he walked past the flower stall where his mother had struggled to breathe, the vendor stopped him. "Chief," she called out, holding out a bunch of bright yellow daffodils, Margaret's favorites. "These are for your mother. Tell her we miss seeing her on Wednesdays." The chief accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. He noticed how the market had changed. Vendors now kept small first aid kits visible at their stalls, and many had taken basic first aid training. The incident had sparked a wave of community preparedness that nobody had expected. Back at the station, Officer Barrett was working on a special project. With the chief's approval, he had started developing a new training module focused on balancing protocol with human judgment. His desk was covered with research papers, personal accounts, and notes from his conversations with Margaret. "You see," he explained to a group of rookie officers, "there's this space between what the rulebook says and what the moment demands. That's where real policing happens." The young officers listened intently, many of them having seen the viral video of his mistake. Margaret, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity, though not in the way anyone might have expected. She started visiting the police academy as a guest speaker, sharing her story not to criticize, but to teach. Her gentle wisdom and forgiveness left a lasting impression on every class she addressed. "Rules are important," she would tell the cadets, her voice warm but firm. "But they're meant to protect people, not prevent us from helping them. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is know when to bend a rule to save a life." The story reached beyond Seattle. Police departments from other cities began requesting copies of Barrett's training materials. Margaret's approach to turning a potential tragedy into a teaching moment was being studied and admired by law enforcement agencies across the country. One day, while reviewing the new training procedures, Chief Henderson found himself emotional as he read through the materials. The incident that could have cost him his mother had instead created a ripple effect of positive change. His mother's forgiveness had transformed not just one officer, but was reshaping how an entire department approached their duty to protect and serve. Mrs. Chen from the market had started a community initiative called Neighbors Looking Out, encouraging local businesses to become safe spaces where people could get help in emergencies. She often told customers, "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of caring." The internal affairs investigation was concluding, and while Officer Barrett's record would show the incident, it would also show his remarkable journey afterward. His personnel file now included letters from community members, including one from Margaret herself, describing how he had turned a mistake into an opportunity for growth and change. As spring turned to summer, the farmers' market where everything had started was busier than ever. Margaret had returned to her Wednesday routine, but now she was greeted like family by every vendor. The spot where she had struggled to breathe had become a symbol of community resilience and the power of forgiveness. And Officer Barrett, though still learning and growing, had found his true calling, teaching others to see the human story behind every police interaction. 6 weeks after the incident, the internal affairs investigation was in full swing, but it had taken an unexpected direction. Instead of focusing solely on Officer Barrett's actions, investigators found themselves examining something much bigger: how rigid protocols sometimes clashed with basic human needs. The investigation room was filled with stacks of similar incidents from across the country, each one highlighting the delicate balance between rules and compassion. Officer Barrett sat nervously in front of the review board, his newly pressed uniform feeling uncomfortably stiff. The room was quiet except for the soft whirring of an old ceiling fan. 5 senior officers, including representatives from other precincts, sat across from him, their faces unreadable as they reviewed his file. Officer Barrett, the head investigator, began, adjusting her glasses. "We've been looking into not just what happened that day, but what's happened since." She paused, shuffling through some papers. "We've received over 50 letters from community members, including Mrs. Henderson, speaking about the changes you've helped implement." The young officer shifted in his seat, remembering the countless hours he'd spent working with community groups, organizing emergency response workshops, and helping Mrs. Chen expand her Neighbors Looking Out program. What had started as his biggest mistake had somehow grown into something much more meaningful. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret was hosting a community meeting in her living room. The space was packed with local business owners, residents, and even a few off-duty officers. They were discussing ways to make their neighborhoods safer and more responsive to emergencies. The smell of Margaret's famous honey lemon cookies filled the air as people shared ideas and experiences. "It's not about pointing fingers anymore," Margaret told the group, pouring tea for everyone. "It's about building bridges between the police and the community." Her words carried the weight of someone who had turned a personal crisis into a catalyst for change. Back at the review board, Officer Barrett was sharing his new perspective. "I used to think being a good officer meant following every rule perfectly," he explained, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Now I understand that our real job is to protect and serve people, not just enforce regulations." The board members exchanged glances as Barrett described the training program he'd helped develop. It included real-life scenarios, role-playing exercises, and most importantly, sessions with community members who shared their experiences with law enforcement. The program was already being noticed by other police departments across the state. Outside the investigation room, Chief Henderson was dealing with his own challenges. The incident had put his department under intense scrutiny, but it had also opened doors for meaningful reform. He'd received calls from police chiefs in other cities, all wanting to know how they'd turned a potential disaster into an opportunity for positive change. Mrs. Chen's market stall had become an unofficial community center. She'd hung a small bulletin board where people could post emergency contact numbers and safety tips. Other vendors had followed her lead, creating a network of safe spaces throughout the market. "We look after each other now," she would say proudly to customers. The investigation board took particular interest in how the incident had affected police-community relations. Crime rates hadn't changed significantly, but something else had. People were more willing to approach officers, to ask for help, to see them as part of the community rather than just authority figures. One of the board members, an older officer with gray hair and kind eyes, spoke up. "Officer Barrett, what would you do differently if you encountered a similar situation today?" The room fell silent, waiting for his response. Barrett thought about Margaret's visits to the academy, about Mrs. Chen's community initiative, about all the changes that had grown from that one terrible decision. "Today," he said slowly, "I would remember that behind every emergency is a person, someone's family member, someone who matters. Protocol is important, but it should guide us, not blind us to human needs." As the investigation continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about one officer's mistake anymore. It was about how a community had come together to turn a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The final report would recommend changes to department policies, but more importantly, it would document how one incident had sparked a transformation in police-community relations that nobody had expected. The public response to the incident reached far beyond Seattle's city limits. 2 months after that fateful day at the farmers' market, local news stations were still covering the story, but with a different angle. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, they were highlighting what had gone right in the aftermath. Margaret had become an unexpected voice for change, though not in the way most people expected. She'd been invited to speak at a town hall meeting about police-community relations. The community center was packed, with people standing along the walls just to hear her speak. Her gentle presence commanded attention in a way that angry protests never could. "You know," she began, adjusting the microphone, "when I couldn't breathe that day, I was scared. But what scares me more is the thought that we might miss this opportunity to learn from each other." The room fell silent, hanging on her every word. Even the reporters in the back lowered their cameras, caught up in the moment. Among the audience sat Officer Barrett, out of uniform, listening intently. He'd been hesitant to attend, but Margaret had personally invited him. Next to him sat Mrs. Chen, who had closed her market stall early just to be there. Their unlikely friendship had become a symbol of community healing. Local television coverage captured the moment when a young girl raised her hand during the question period. "Mrs. Henderson," she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "aren't you angry at the police officer?" The room held its breath, all eyes moving between Margaret and Barrett. Margaret smiled warmly. "Anger is easy," she replied, looking directly at Barrett. "Understanding is harder. And change, real change, that's the hardest of all. But it's also the most important." Her words brought tears to many eyes in the room, including Barrett's. The story had caught the attention of national media. News vans lined the streets outside the community center, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. But inside, something more important was happening. People weren't just talking about police reform. They were actually listening to each other. Social media buzzed with clips from the town hall. One particular moment went viral, when Mrs. Chen stood up and shared how her neighbor's Looking Out program had grown from one market stall to cover 30 local businesses. "Sometimes," she said, her accent thick with emotion, "it takes a moment of crisis to show us how strong we can be together." Chief Henderson watched from the back of the room, pride and amazement mixing on his face. His mother had turned a potentially tragic incident into a movement for positive change. The department's new training programs, inspired by the incident, were already showing promising results. Local businesses had started putting up safe space stickers in their windows, indicating they were part of Mrs. Chen's network. The farmers' market where everything had started now had a weekly community outreach booth, staffed by off-duty officers who helped people learn basic emergency response. A local high school teacher had even developed a curriculum around the incident, teaching students about civic responsibility and the importance of community engagement. The students were particularly moved by Margaret's forgiveness and Barrett's willingness to learn from his mistakes. During a break in the town hall meeting, people gathered around tables laden with Margaret's honey lemon cookies and Mrs. Chen's special tea. Officers chatted with community members, sharing stories and finding common ground. The divide between police and public was slowly healing. Barrett found himself surrounded by a small group of young officers from neighboring districts, all eager to learn from his experience. The hardest part, he told them, wasn't facing the investigation or the public criticism. It was realizing that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important lessons. As the evening wound down, Margaret stood with Chief Henderson, watching the crowd mingle. "You know, Michael," she said softly, "sometimes things have to go wrong before they can go right." Her son squeezed her hand, understanding that his mother's wisdom had helped transform a crisis into an opportunity for growth. The media coverage that night would show clips of speeches and sound bites, but the real story was in the small moments. The handshakes between officers and citizens, the exchange of phone numbers, the promises to stay in touch and keep working together. What had started as one officer's mistake had grown into a community's determination to do better. 3 months after the town hall meeting, the Seattle Police Department was buzzing with activity. The reform efforts sparked by the inhaler incident had grown into something much bigger. Chief Henderson stood in the department's main training room, watching as Officer Barrett conducted a session with a new batch of recruits. The room looked different now. Gone were the stark walls and intimidating police posters. Instead, photos of community events and success stories lined the walls. A large banner hung at the front read, "Protect, Serve, Understand," the department's new unofficial motto that had emerged from the changes. "Your badge gives you authority," Barrett explained to the eager faces before him, "but it's your humanity that gives you respect." He shared his story openly, no longer ashamed but using it as a powerful teaching tool. The recruits leaned forward in their chairs, captivated by the honesty in his voice. Meanwhile, at the farmers' market, Margaret was having tea with Mrs. Chen at her stall. The market had transformed over the past months. Every vendor now had a small emergency kit, and many had taken first aid courses. But more importantly, there was a new sense of connection between the vendors and the community they served. "Look at that." Mrs. Chen smiled, pointing to a police officer chatting easily with customers nearby. 6 months ago, people would have been nervous. Now they're sharing recipes. The officer was part of the department's new community engagement program, which stationed officers at local gatherings not to patrol, but to participate. Back at the station, Chief Henderson was reviewing the latest statistics. Emergency response times had improved, but something else stood out. Community complaints had dropped significantly. People weren't just feeling safer, they were feeling more connected to those who served them. The training room had a special guest that afternoon, an emergency room doctor who was teaching officers about common medical emergencies. Sometimes, she explained, demonstrating with an inhaler, waiting for protocol can cost someone their life. You need to know when to act. Barrett listened from the back of the room, remembering that day at the market. His uniform felt different now, less like armor and more like a symbol of responsibility. He touched the small pin on his collar, a new addition to the department's uniform representing completed crisis response training. In the break room, officers discussed their recent experiences with the new approach. One officer shared how she'd helped an elderly man having a diabetic episode, knowing when to act quickly thanks to the new training. Another talked about preventing a domestic situation from escalating by remembering to see the human side first. Margaret had become a regular visitor to the academy, but not as a lecturer. Instead, she would sit in during training sessions, offering a grandmother's perspective on police work. Her presence reminded the officers that every person they encountered was someone's family member. The local news did a follow-up story, highlighting the changes in the department. They interviewed Mrs. Chen about her now citywide Neighbors Looking Out program. "It's simple," she told the reporter, serving her famous tea. "When we stop seeing uniforms and start seeing people, everything changes." Officer Barrett's training program had caught the attention of other departments across the state. He'd been invited to share his experience at several police academies, always starting with his mistake and ending with the lessons learned. His honesty and vulnerability made his message powerful. At home, Chief Henderson shared dinner with his mother, something that had become a weekly tradition since the incident. "You know," he said, cutting into his pot roast, "what happened that day was terrible. But look at all the good that's come from it." Margaret smiled, remembering the scared young officer who had denied her help, and seeing how far he'd come. "Sometimes," she replied, passing the potatoes, "it takes a moment of darkness to help us see the light more clearly." The department's new approach was becoming a model for others. What had started as a crisis of judgment had evolved into a revolution of understanding. Officers were learning that their most powerful tool wasn't their authority or their equipment, it was their ability to see the humanity in every situation. As the sun set over Seattle that evening, Officer Barrett stood at the market where everything had changed. The spot where Margaret had struggled to breathe was now marked with a small plaque, "Where compassion meets duty." It served as a daily reminder that sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most important changes. 6 months after the inhaler incident, the Seattle Police Department gathered for a special ceremony. The community center was packed with officers, local residents, and media representatives. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, highlighting the Community First banner that hung proudly over the stage. Chief Henderson stood at the podium, his voice carrying years of experience and newfound wisdom. "Today marks not just a change in policy," he began, "but a transformation in how we serve our community." His eyes scanned the crowd, finding his mother sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Officer Barrett sat next to Margaret, no longer the nervous young officer who had made a terrible mistake, but a changed man who had helped reshape his department's approach to public service. He wore a new pin on his uniform, a small silver shield with a heart in its center, symbolizing the department's new emphasis on compassionate policing. Mrs. Chen had closed her market stall for the day, bringing enough of her special tea for everyone. The refreshment table looked like a community potluck, with Margaret's honey lemon cookies placed next to treats from various local businesses. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a celebration of community unity. The chief unveiled the department's new emergency response protocols, developed with input from medical professionals, community leaders, and officers alike. These guidelines, he explained, are built on a simple truth, that every emergency involves a person, not just a procedure. Local news cameras captured the moment when Margaret was invited to the stage. She walked up slowly, supported by Officer Barrett on one side and Mrs. Chen on the other. The audience rose in a standing ovation, recognizing the woman whose forgiveness had sparked a movement. "When I couldn't breathe that day," Margaret began, her voice clear and strong, "I never imagined it would lead to this. But sometimes life's hardest moments become our greatest teachers." She looked at Barrett, who nodded slightly, remembering how far they'd both come. The ceremony included the graduation of the first class of officers trained under the new program. 25 fresh faces, each one having learned not just about law enforcement, but about human connection. They had spent time working in community gardens, visiting senior centers, and volunteering at local schools. A young officer shared her experience from the new training program. "We learned that every badge covers a heart," she said, "and that our strongest weapon is our ability to listen." Her words resonated through the room, touching both veterans and rookies alike. Chief Henderson announced that the department's new approach had caught national attention. Police academies across the country were requesting information about their training program. What had started as one department's response to a crisis was becoming a blueprint for change. Mrs. Chen took the stage to share how her Neighbors Looking Out program had expanded to 3 neighboring cities. "We don't just watch out for trouble anymore," she explained, her face glowing. "We watch out for each other." The ceremony concluded with the dedication of a new community response center, built right next to the farmers' market. It would serve as both a police substation and a community gathering space, with regular workshops on emergency response and community safety. As people mingled after the ceremony, Officer Barrett found himself surrounded by young officers from other districts, eager to learn from his experience. "Remember," he told them, "your biggest mistake might become your greatest opportunity to make a difference." Margaret watched the scene with satisfaction, seeing officers and citizens chatting like old friends over cookies and tea. The divide that had once seemed so wide had been bridged by understanding and compassion. Chief Henderson joined his mother, watching the crowd. "You know, Mom," he said softly, "sometimes I think about how differently this could have turned out." Margaret patted his hand, understanding the weight of his words. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the community center windows, the gathering showed no signs of ending. People were exchanging phone numbers, making plans for future community events, and sharing stories. The last image captured by the news cameras that evening was of Officer Barrett and Margaret standing by the new community center's entrance. Above them hung a simple plaque that read, "Where crisis became community." It was more than just a happy ending. It was a new beginning, built on the foundation of one mistake and countless acts of forgiveness and understanding.